So, welcome to part two on this lecture, Police on the Streets, and looking at the organization and how law enforcement works. Now, by now, you should have seen part one. If you haven't seen part one, you need to backtrack, go look at part one. It's a pretty lengthy lecture, but as I shared in that part, law enforcement is one of the backgrounds that I have great expertise and knowledge in. And so I was really thrilled to break down this lecture into two parts. Realistically, it could be three parts, but because this is an online learning forum, I don't want to belabor the point. So I wanted to go ahead and break it down into part one and part two. Where we left off is we were talking about diversity in law enforcement. We talked about gender issues in law enforcement, how, nearly there's only about maybe between 13 to 17% of all law enforcement officers are females. So there's a lot of struggles there. We also talked about how about 72% of law enforcement officers are white, minorities, as in people of color, brown people, even Asian individuals. They are not making up or not. The law enforcement agency is not comprised of a larger diversity of population of those individuals. So we still have a lot of work to do. But when we picking up here on part two, I want to talk about this concept of community policing. And again, I know this is an introduction course, so it feels like it's a lot of information kind of condensed and it's a crash course. But community policing is very important simply because it's a philosophy that adopts proactive measures and community collaboration. Before I continue on with the lecture, you see the image that I've had on your screen. And yes, this was back during 2020. As you all know, 2020 was a very perilous time, not just from the pandemic standpoint, but we had a significant uprising in social justice with what happened as it relates to people of color. Famous cases such as George Floyd and Jacob Blake, Rayshard Brooks. There was a lot of cases that came out during 2020 that sparked widespread protests. And so, when you see law enforcement officers like here kind of giving each other the elbow dab, because it was COVID and you didn't want to touch people too much. This was a great example of community-oriented policing. It's showing that community collaboration, seeing that law enforcement officers are just normal people. All that separates them is they have a badge and a gun. That's it. They're normal people. They bleed the same. They bleed the same. They have to eat. They go to sleep. They have problems. All of those things. And when looking at community-oriented policing, some of the key components include partnerships, police coming together and collaborating with others, the organizational transformation, having management personnel and information systems that support community partners. In other words, it's okay for the community to feel like this is our law enforcement agency. While we are not going to tell the police what to do, we're going to collaborate with them in order to make and affect the changes that we need. Also having problem solving, having a systematic examination of crime-related issues and coming up with an effective response. So community-oriented policing is a very important style of policing because as long as the community feels a level of comfort with working with law enforcement and vice versa, it's going to create a more well-rounded working relationship as opposed to people resenting the police. Now, another kind of example of community-oriented policing is something called problem-oriented policing, or a POP. COP is community-oriented policing. POP is problem-oriented policing. And with problem-oriented policing, it's going to address crime problems, primarily using data. And it uses what's called the SARA model. The SARA model stands for scan, analyze, respond, and assess. If you're scanning, you should be identifying and prioritizing problems. What are the problems? How can we identify the problems? If you're analyzing, we should research the problem, find out where the problem is coming from, or can we identify where the problem is? Responding, let's develop long-lasting solutions. How are we going to respond to the problem that has been brought forth to us and brought to our attention? And then lastly, we want to provide an assessment, evaluate the success of the response. If you provide a response to a problem, you want to be able to assess whether that response is successful. Because if we're looking at problem-oriented policing, and let's just say we know we live in an area where there's a whole lot of burglaries, right? And we say we're going to put more cops and more law enforcement officer in that area. But let's say the burglaries don't go down, they go up. We can assess that the response is ineffective. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. If you have more law enforcement officers in an area and the problem doesn't get better, it gets worse, we can assess that what we're doing is not working. So we need to come up with a solution to fix that problem. Maybe the solution is even more law enforcement. Maybe the solution is we try to do some vice work where we try to infiltrate these burglary rings, whatever the case may be, but you have to evaluate the success of the response. So the crime triangle, essentially, when looking at community-oriented policing, focuses on those immediate concerns present in the environment to confront difficult issues. Within that crime triangle, typically you have the offender, you have the victim, and you have the law enforcement response. They all are a piece of the triangle, and then on each side you have the potential for crime, so to speak. But when looking at community policing, it is important to understand that if we're trying to find out the problem while trying to engage with the community, we have to identify what are some of those high crime areas. What are some of the geographical locations where you're going to see the most crime? Wherever you live, whatever city you live in, whatever community you live in, there's an area of town that has more crime than others. You don't need me to tell you because you already know. And if you don't know, it would benefit you to know. Having said that, understand that the highest crime area in a given city is called the Mike Zone, all right? The Mike Zone. When I was in law enforcement, southwest side of town in the city I lived in was primarily known as the Mike Zone. And it wasn't the whole southwest side of that town or city. It was particular areas and neighborhoods that had that distinction. And we called it the Mike Zone. That was the highest crime area in the city. And sometimes when identifying a Mike Zone, law enforcement wants to engage in what's called zero tolerance, having this approach that, hey, we're going to target the disorder and minor crime in the hot spots because we want to send a message that the major crimes, we're coming for you. But even if you do little crimes, we're still coming for you because we're going to show that we're trying to clean up this Mike Zone and we don't want this to be our hottest bed or hottest area of crime. And so, again, looking at the triangle, as you see, you have your offender, you have your target victim, and then you have your place. And then, of course, in the middle is the problem. When we look at routine activities theory, again, this is not a criminal theories class. I have one of those. But when you have a motivated offender, a suitable victim, and the absence of a capable guardian, when they all intersect, that is when you have crime. So with respect to 21st century policing, there's major principles of procedural justice. Some people argue that to have effective policing in the 21st century, which is in this millennium, especially over the last 10 to 15 years per se, citizens have to have a collaborative effort. They have to have a voice. They have to be able to process and tell their side of the event to officers. Now, let me tell you this much. When you're working in law enforcement and when you're dealing with law enforcement, understand that there's no time for a law enforcement officer to get the full side of the story, determine that that side of the story is correct, and be able to decipher whether or not they're going to utilize their discretion in either taking someone to jail or not taking someone to jail or whatever the case may be. Like, they don't have that, right? They don't have that time. But some people argue that we have to put forth a system in place to say, all right, citizens should be able to talk to law enforcement officers and should be able to share with law enforcement officers their concerns and their sides of the event, even if it's after the fact. Officers absolutely should be neutral. They should treat people with dignity and politeness, and they should even be trustworthy and caring. All of these were those core principles that I talked about a couple of chapters ago with Robert Peel when he came up with those Peelian principles, right? And this 21st century policing is no different. What it is it's hearkening back to how law enforcement should be acting and how law enforcement should be responding to community members. But when looking at 21st century policing, there's still this notion or this idea of this attribution theory, because what happens when we see publicized shootings, especially involving minority suspects? Think about the stereotypes that Black people, and even brown people for that matter, have. Think about the stereotypes that are often perpetuated. Oh, person had to do the crime, they must be Black. People broke into their houses, oh, they must be Black. We see 5, 6, 7 cops surrounding a car, and we see Black driver. Oh, yeah, he must be dangerous. Like, those are stereotypes that I've heard in and out of the profession. And so I want you to ponder this question, and would be a question that I would certainly want to open up for a dialogue, especially in an in-person class, even if when I've lectured this class in front of hundreds of students. Should police respond to interactions with minorities in a hostile manner? In other words, when a police officer rolls up on a scene of a crime and interacts with a minority, person of color, Black person, brown person, should they automatically have a hostile demeanor? And then why do you personally believe that law enforcement sometimes respond in that tone? Once again, the purpose of having this type of discussion and question is not to continue to perpetuate the stereotypes that exist when it comes to law enforcement interactions with minorities. It's to have a dialogue. Because as I like to say to my students, I like to give you a forum to talk, but I also believe in us talking about tough subjects. I always say in my classes on day one, if we can't talk about it in here, then how can we talk about it out there? If we can't talk about it in the safest space that you'll ever have in your life, which is the classroom, how can you talk about it in the streets? How can you talk about it in the meeting room? How can you talk about it in the boardroom? How can you talk about it? So ponder these questions as you continue to go on, not just in this lecture, but in this course, and certainly in life. Even if you're not a criminal justice major, even if you're watching this video because you just want to learn more, I want you to ponder these questions the next time you see police interactions with people of color and minorities. So President Obama, even though we're talking several presidencies ago, why this is relevant and why this is important is because President Obama put this task force together to really address 21st century policing, modernizing policing and bringing it back to the core tenets that Sir Robert Peel put together a long time ago, way back in the 1800s. Law enforcement should build trust and legitimacy. They should use technology and social media. They should be trained and educated. They absolutely have to practice wellness and safety. And that's a wonderful segue into wellness and safety. In the last lecture, the one I recorded, I talked about some of the stressors that exist in law enforcement, not being healthy, not taking care of themselves. But I also talked about the stressors of potentially, taking their own life. Understand that this thing, cop line is an officer's lifeline. If you are somebody that's in law enforcement that's struggling with mental illness, they can actually go to Copline. This is an officer's lifeline. They can type in copline.org. There's a phone number. I'm holding it up. And they can talk to somebody and receive live help 24/7, where these individuals are trained to try to help them understand that they're not alone. And so officer wellness and safety is very important. And that's why it was very critical for me to get this Copline flyer that I got from a conference a year ago, because I am still tied to law enforcement And I kept this for the purposes of sharing it because I might have students who have family members in law enforcement and they have nowhere to turn. Well, now you got your professor who can say, utilize Copline. This is a tool for anybody that's in law enforcement that might be struggling with a dark thoughts and need some assistance. So think about Copline. So controversial issues exist in policing. One of those controversial issues is the use of force. Officers are trained rather to use an appropriate level of force, and that force is designed based on the totality of circumstances. So again, ponder some of these questions. When is it appropriate for an officer to use deadly force? Are there circumstances where this is acceptable? We obviously know that if someone is taking someone hostage, or if a suspect is potentially going to harm someone to the point of death, deadly force becomes very much acceptable and appropriate. But again, these are questions we would ponder and debate and discuss in class. Now, the continuum of force, and I've taken continuum of force courses. Usually I try to take one every year. This is a guideline for the degree of force used in an arrest, which also depends on the suspect's demeanor, weapons, and level of compliance. I have notes and notes from some of the law enforcement trainers here in Georgia who teach out at the training academy. They do a continuum of force block at the conference I attend every year. I'm going to the conference again this year. I'm excited about it. But again, in law enforcement, you are protected under the law to use whatever force is necessary to get the suspect, to get the perpetrator under your control. However, that use of force does not require you punching them in the face for no reason, right? That use of force does not require you manhandling them and kicking them and spitting on them because they called you something derogatory, right? You do have to use force to get a person under control, to get a suspect under control, but this continuum of force is the guideline on how much force is used. Now, it's always going to be controversial. And as I've sat in that training, and the gentleman who taught the training was very well versed, very well respected, and had been in law enforcement for nearly 30 years. However, you still have to maintain your level of professionalism because you can find yourself in front of a review board or have the state come in and you don't want to have your standards or your procedures or your tactics challenged. So it is a major issue that sometimes has to be addressed. And another problem when it comes to the continuum of force is that the media focuses on instances where lethal force is used. So that can neglect the facts of the situation. Again, I love this topic, and that's why, in theory, I break it into 3 lectures. I really can do this for 4 or 5 lectures just because of my experience and so many notable cases, noteworthy cases that have happened just in the last few years. Right or wrong, it is worth discussing. So what about these controversial issues in policing, such as Back the Blue and Blue Lives Matter? You know, Blue Lives Matter is also known as Police Lives Matter. It's a counter movement in the United States advocating that those who are prosecuted and convicted of killing law enforcement officers should be sentenced under hate crimes. Back the Blue is a movement which highlights law enforcement officers, citizens, organizations, and the community coming together to forge a positive relationship with law enforcement. Sometimes you're driving down the road and you see the flag with the blue line. That's an indicator of either Blue Lives Matter or Back the Blue. It's so controversial because just like there's Black Lives Matter and just like there's other, just like there's, other lives matter, whatever some of the different slogans are. I don't know. Many have said Blue Lives Matter is so controversial, and it's not my job or my place to say it's a controversial movement. It's just people coming together saying, hey, if you kill a law enforcement officer, you should be held and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And generally speaking, if you do kill a law enforcement officer, you will Should you be counted and killed? Should you be charged as a hate crime? Again, this is a debate for class. Are these movements and slogans controversial? It's up to you to decide. And it also depends on who you ask. So in terms of fatal police shootings, we don't have the 2024 data yet. Data takes a long time to release. We'll probably get the 2024 data within the next few months. But in 2023, 1,329 people were killed by police. That number is up from the 1,250 killed in 2022. Even though these are numbers showing people that were taken out by law enforcement, you do have to understand that not all shootings are unjustified. In other words, there are plenty of instances where the perpetrator had a weapon, law enforcement gave a command, drop the weapon, drop the weapon, drop the weapon. They didn't drop the weapon, and then they had to act, right? There's a situation where the perpetrator may have been fighting with law enforcement. Hey, I'm gonna fight you, or I'm fighting with you, and they were told to back off, stop fighting, and then something happened. Like not all shootings are unjustified, So it's just one of the things that speaks to the controversy, because many people say, why didn't you tase them? Why didn't you use something else? And that is a great, that'll be a great segue in just a moment when looking at the other tools that law enforcement officers have. But when we speak about and we focus on and we look at, again, these controversial issues, we do understand that racial profiling exists, right? So when an officer questions somebody based on their race, their ethnicity, remember when I talked about Gerber Grawal a couple of chapters ago, and I pointed out that Gerber Grawal, he often gets mistook and was mistook as a terrorist. He's not a terrorist. If you're questioning people because you see them having a hijab around their head, or they have garb indicative of coming from the Middle East or from Somalia or from other countries, that's where some racial profiling comes into play, and it's wrong and it's problematic, especially in law enforcement, right? Because law enforcement is the most visible aspect of the criminal justice system. So there are some very controversial tactics in law enforcement. For example, racial profiling, stop and frisk, DWB. DWB stands for driving while black. Sometimes people will also say driving while brown. If you're a person of color, if you're black, if you're brown, you're at an exponentially greater and higher risk of getting pulled over by law enforcement in traffic stops. And like I said, I wish I had more time to elaborate on this. I certainly wish that we could talk about this if this was an in-person class. But I'll be honest, I've been pulled over for stuff, and a lot of times it's stuff that I didn't do, and I'd be like, hello, law enforcement. Oh, I'm sorry. It happens, right? It happens. So imagine this notion, and imagine this idea that if you're a person of color, you're more likely to get stopped, and the data supports it. You don't need Professor Fields saying, well, he's a black guy, of course he's going to say it. No. What you can do is you can look at the data, and the data supports it. If you don't believe me, go look up stop and frisk in New York City. Just go look up stop and frisk in New York City. Matter of fact, you know what? I believe in later chapters, I actually pulled the data from stop and frisk in New York City. It is mind-blowing what the data showed, how the stops were for people of color, how they were for white people, how they were for Asian people. It's mind-blowing. We'll get to that in a later chapter. So in terms of other controversies, think about social media. Social media assists law enforcement. It allows them to communicate with citizens. You can leave anonymous tips. It can increase positive community interactions. Also, it can help when it comes to catching offenders who post on social media. In other classes, I talk about people who I've dealt with many times, how they post things on social media, and it's just lovely because it makes my case that much stronger. It also makes it easier when I have to go ask for a warrant. We love social media. Criminals love social media too. They just don't think law enforcement is smart enough to track them down on social media. Technology also plays a key role. Think about how you have halo cameras. Controversial, yes, but these are remote control cameras that allow for observation of areas of interest. They're found on street corners. I mean, even right now in one of the law enforcement chat groups I'm a part of, we had some we had some criminal activity going on near us, and essentially with over here we call them flock. FLOCK, flock, but they're the same thing as the halo cameras. And so some people were like, hey, I've reviewed flock cameras, I don't see these people. And then someone else was like, oh, I found them, they're over here. So halo cameras are remote controlled, but some might argue they're controversial because anybody can appear on these cameras. The ALPRs, the automated license plate recognition, they read license plates instantly. You don't need to be the cop. I gotta type in the license plate. No, you don't have to type that in. The ALPR, which you can kind of see it a little bit on the back of this police car, but it's like almost like a camera. It'll read a license plate instantly. That car is stolen. The car belongs to this person. All of these things. But these are great tools to help law enforcement officers respond and act in a quick and orderly fashion. And so the question becomes, does this violate the Fourth Amendment? Well, we're going to talk about amendments when we get to the court block of this course. So if you're not familiar with the Fourth Amendment, I'm going to educate you, and we're going to have a discussion about the Fourth Amendment because you need to know this is arguably one of your most important amendments that you have as an American citizen. And so lastly, let's talk about some of the tools that law enforcement officers use. The non-lethal force. We know law enforcement officers carry a Glock 9mm handgun, right? We know that. However, there's other tools they have. They have OC or oleoresin capsicum pepper spray, so OC pepper spray. Sometimes they can use rubber bullets. Rubber bullets would hurt like heck if you got shot with one. It won't kill you, but it'll leave a nasty bruise. Tasers are their most notable and useful weapons, and that taser providing that jolt of electricity to the body of the perpetrator, most of the times it will stun them and incapacitate them, and then after they're tased and they come to, then you can effect the arrest. Batons are very useful as well. Batons, you can use a baton as you see in the image right there. You can use that to strike an offender a few times to get them to comply. But unfortunately, what we've seen is that sometimes these non-lethal restraints, sometimes they don't work. Sometimes you get perpetrators who fight back. You tase them and they're still coming. You spray them and they're still coming. You're whacking them with a baton and they're still coming. They're getting the upper hand on you as the police officer. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And that's why many people in the public will say, why didn't they tase him? It's a high pressure situation. Maybe they did. Why weren't they better at fighting one-on-one? Have you been in a fight with somebody that might be 3 times your size or who might be on an illegal narcotic and they're out of their mind? Unfortunately, we see and we hear this question far too often. And so what happens? 2 possible reasons on why sometimes non-lethal force may have been used in the absence of non-lethal force. 1, it's a high-pressure split-second decision that can lead to an error. In other words, yes, you may have meant to use the taser. Yes, you may have meant to grab another tool. You grabbed your firearm instinctively because it's right on your holster. You're more often than not, you're ready to grab your firearm. It's just there. And this other 4-letter word is commonly used when people or when law enforcement officers sometimes make mistakes when they did not mean to use deadly force. Fear. Fear is a key word. That if a law enforcement officer is scared and in that moment they're fearful of what this perpetrator might do, sometimes mistakes are made. So I want to thank you for listening to this awesome chapter, this 5th chapter, Police on the Streets, Organization, Responsibilities, and Challenges. again, I could easily have talked about this for four videos, four chapters, four videos, four lectures. There's so much to take away from. Look at the chain of command. Remember that the police chief is appointed by the mayor. The sheriff is voted by the citizens of the community. Remember that. Remember how, when it comes to patrol, they're the backbone of policing. They're the most important area in any police agency or in law enforcement, because you're going to have the most officers on patrol. Think about some of the controversy surrounding law enforcement. Blue Lives Matter and Back the Blue. But then what about deadly force? And what about technology? Are you comfortable knowing that you're just driving down the road and the police scan your license plate? They see who you are, where you live, your name, all your information. What if that's an officer that sees you and you're a nice looking young lady or young man, and that officer is infatuated with you, and now they know where you live, and now they're showing up at your place randomly, or they're stopping you thinking you think you did something wrong, and it's just to kind of get your attention, just to kind of see how you interact with them, and maybe they're using that for their advantage. It's scary stuff. But either way, recognize that law enforcement is a very, very intricate area, and it's a very intricate field that not a lot of people understand. So I want to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next chapter.